Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Have you ever noticed how we tend to judge by appearances? An elderly man walks into an elite golf club dressed in simple clothes, and within seconds he becomes the target of jokes. After all, what could an old man possibly teach on a golf course ruled by youth, vanity, and arrogance? But what no one knew, and what you're about to discover, is that this man carried more technique in his hands than many medalists have in their trophy cases. And the most impressive part? He didn't say a word. He let his swing do the talking. This isn't just another one of those stories about overcoming adversity. It's a lesson about judgment, about age, about silent power. A real, thought-provoking, and deeply counterintuitive story. Because in this video you'll see that true giants don't always have sponsors, but they always have purpose. And maybe after this, you'll never treat a stranger the same way again. Prepare to feel moved, and to rethink a few things. On that humid Sunday morning, Mr. Samuel stepped through the golden gate of the most exclusive golf club in the region. He wore a wrinkled cotton shirt, worn-out pants, and shoes that had seen many greens. In his hands, an old wooden club marked by time. He looked out of place in that sea of excess where every accessory screamed ego more than purpose. And as many stories begin, the whispers came first. Quick, mean, and careless. Among the younger players, judgment came before a single good morning. Some laughed, others discreetly pulled out their phones to record the lost grandpa on the rich man's turf. The reception was as cold as marble. Side eyes, sarcastic smirks, and comments like, "Is he here to mow the lawn?" It's strange how prejudice often wears a mask of humor, and how many stories of greatness are born in environments soaked with hidden contempt. And there, without realizing it, everyone was about to become a background character in the club's greatest twist. Samuel didn't say a word. He simply walked to the edge of the course like someone who knew the land before the fences were built. His silence was different. It wasn't fear, but the kind of quiet held by someone who's heard too much empty noise. And that, my friend, unsettles those addicted to instant applause. These quiet stories that sneak in through the back door and transform the entire room are always the most powerful. But who there was ready to see an old man become the center of attention? Brian was the typical prodigy molded by vanity. Too many trophies to listen to advice, too many compliments to realize how much he still needed to learn. When he saw Samuel standing there with his old club and calm eyes, he couldn't resist the urge to assert dominance. With a smug grin, he quipped, "Want to take a swing, Grandpa? Try not to trip." The crowd laughed, not because it was funny, but because they were laughing at themselves without knowing it. And thus began the stories that would become lifelong lessons. Samuel simply smiled. That kind of smile that bothers those who still think arrogance equals strength. No rebuttal, no raised voice, no need to prove anything. Just a gaze that said everything. He knew time teaches better than words, and some answers don't need a voice, just action. In that moment, patience became strategy. How many stories have been buried because someone chose to win instead of listen? The challenge was set. Brian thought he was in control, the lead actor on a stage built for his own ego. But he underestimated the one detail you should never ignore: experience. Because talent can be loud, but wisdom is quiet, and dangerous to those who can't see it. Samuel walked calmly, adjusted the club like leafing through an old book, knowing exactly the next line. And without knowing it, everyone there was about to become a living chapter of one of the greatest stories ever told at that club. Slowly, applause began, hesitant at first, like claps asking for forgiveness, then stronger, more sincere. It was as if every handbeat whispered, "We did you wrong, Samuel." The old man smiled, not in triumph, but in peace. The smile of someone who's been judged too many times to need to prove anything, just to show if he chooses. And that day, he chose to. Because some stories must be told without a single word. Brian was the first to approach. The same Brian who, minutes earlier, had loudly declared, "This old man is lost. Someone get him out of here." Now he walked in silence, face red, pride in pieces. He stopped a few steps from Samuel and extended his hand. "I'm sorry, sir. I was an idiot." Samuel gripped the young man's hand firmly, looked deep into his eyes, and replied, "You were just young." That answer shattered what pride was left. Stories that heal always come wrapped in that kind of simplicity. Then one of the older caddies came closer, eyes shining with recognition. "That swing, I've seen it before. In 1974, state tournament. Same move, same precision. You're Samuel R. King? The name echoed like a whisper slicing through generations. Some young players Googled the name, and there they were. Old headlines, black and white, digital treasures. Golf King wins again. Samuel R. King unbeatable on the green. Young faces that once carried disdain now radiated respect. These stories don't age. They ripen. Samuel had stopped competing decades ago after losing his wife. He stepped away from the spotlight, turned down interviews and invitations. He preferred the silence of the grass, solitary training on cold mornings, and the old club, a wedding gift, as his only companion. He didn't want a stage. He wanted peace. But fate has a strange habit of placing us exactly where we'll be seen, even when we'd rather stay invisible. And in that unexpected reunion, his stories came back to life. When a teenager, initially filming just to mock the crazy old man, posted the video, it spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, Samuel's name was trending on social media, in sports blogs, in casual conversations. But it wasn't just the perfect shot that captivated people. It was what it symbolized: resilience, humility, dignity. Because some stories strike deeper than the hole on the green. They strike the hearts of those still able to feel. The club, once a stage for cruel laughter, became a pilgrimage site. Kids wanted to meet the man with the magic club. Journalists requested interviews. Former rivals sent letters, flowers, memories. And through it all, Samuel kept doing what he always did. Woke up early, drank coffee from the same chipped mug, laced up his old sneakers, and headed to the course. No fanfare, no rush. Because the best stories aren't rushed. They're nurtured. It was inevitable. Pressured by public opinion, the club's board reached out to honor him. But Samuel declined. No plaques, no speeches. He agreed to a conversation, but with one condition. I want to bring kids from the outskirts to train here. I want this course that once ignored me to be a bridge, not a wall. The club, caught off guard, had no choice but to yield. Because when a story starts transforming, it doesn't knock. It enters. And so the Roots of the Green project was born. Samuel, with the calm of someone who has seen the world change colors many times, led the sessions. Kids enchanted by the silence of the course. Teens learning focus, respect, patience. Brian, now his apprentice, taught with humility. Everyone wanted to hear the stories of the man who became a symbol of quiet wisdom. And Samuel? He simply smiled, watched, guided, never with superiority, always with presence. Some parents cried, watching their children excited about a sport once seen as inaccessible. They spoke of improvements in school, behavior, self-esteem. Samuel explained, golf teaches you to fail with dignity. It shows that victory isn't in the shout, it's in the silence between a mistake and the next move. These stories multiplied. In no time, the elite course became a field of possibilities. Symbolic walls fell one by one. That old club? It became a relic, framed with the inscription, "This club did more than any speech ever could." It silenced prejudice with precision. Visitors donated balls, clubs, uniforms. Companies got involved. The project turned into public policy in other cities. All because one old man didn't respond with shouting, but with skill. Didn't strike back in anger, but with elegance. Because some stories become eternal by how they're told, with soul. In the following years, Samuel was invited to speak on TV shows, at sports events, and conferences. He accepted only a few. He preferred being with the children on the field than in grand halls. And when asked what touched him most, he'd always say, "It's seeing someone the world thinks is too small find a place where they feel like a giant inside." That's what his stories stirred, soul expansion. One time at a junior tournament, a 9-year-old girl made a hole-in-one. When asked who her biggest idol was, she replied without hesitation, "Mr. Samuel, because he taught me the most important thing is to breathe before you swing." The quote went viral. When Samuel heard it, he simply said, "Then it was worth coming back." And just like that, another story closed like a cycle, not an end, but a beginning. Years later, a life-size statue was placed on the course, portraying Samuel in the exact pose of that iconic swing. It wasn't made of gold or marble. It was built from pieces of clubs donated by children from the project, a symbol that true greatness isn't measured by material, but by impact. The plaque read, "Stories born from respect never die." Because in the end, this isn't just the story of an old golfer. It's the story of how the world can still change when someone chooses not to strike back with the same coin, when someone, like Samuel, chooses to inspire instead of humiliate, to teach instead of silence, and to turn prejudice into respect. People began to see him differently. The same old man who minutes earlier had seemed invisible was now the center of attentive and respectful gazes. That quiet presence, once discomforting in its simplicity, now enchanted with its mystery. And in that contrast, many there realized an uncomfortable truth. What ages first isn't the body, it's the gaze corrupted by judgment. Because some people carry more stories within them than all the trophies in that luxurious room combined. And these stories don't need spotlights, just eyes that know how to see beyond the surface. In the trophy room, a group of young players began flipping through an old club registry book. Among unknown names and forgotten statistics, Samuel's name appeared often. He had trained there, won tournaments, represented the country in international championships. One of the trophies, tucked away on a low shelf, had his name engraved in gold letters, Best Player of 1974. But why had no one ever spoken of it? Why didn't the club celebrate that living legend? The answer was bitter. Samuel disappeared after losing his wife. He chose silence, solitude, withdrawal. And the world, always chasing shining stories, easily forgets the stories that teach from the shadows. As the news spread like wildfire, more people approached, not with invasive questions, but with genuine respect. Some reached out a hand, others simply nodded. And Samuel, he remained the same, serene, humble, with a gentle smile on his lips and eyes lost in a time when sport was still made of soul. When asked why he hadn't introduced himself as a former champion, he replied simply, "I didn't come for the past. I came for myself." That phrase, whispered tenderly, became a sort of mantra, because that's where the essence of great stories lives, in what's done not for applause but for love. In the locker room, amid new clubs and personalized bags, the conversation shifted. No one talked about the latest shoe model or the brand of a member's watch. Now the topic was Samuel, a player who had endured decades, lost everything, and returned to the field not to prove anything, but to live what remained with dignity. Many began to reflect. How many Samuels had passed through their lives unnoticed? How many stories had been ignored because of a rushed look, a simple outfit, a head of white hair? That afternoon, something changed in the club. Not in the carpets, not on the walls, but in their hearts. The golf course, once a stage for vanity, became a place of learning. Respect returned. Humility was invited to stay. And Samuel, with his old club and slow steps, became the master none of them knew they needed. Not for perfect shots, but for the silent lesson of someone who had lived much and still had much to teach. Days later, a local journalist published a feature titled, "The Ghost Who Came Back to Teach." It spoke of Samuel, his return, and the impact he had without meaning to cause any. The article went viral, and with it, stories began to sprout from every corner. People who had played with him in the past sent letters. Former rivals recalled epic matches, and also the kindness between holes. One woman said Samuel donated all his prize money from a tournament to help a refugee camp in the 80s, and never told anyone. Another said he took care of the club's janitor when he got sick, secretly paying for his medicine. Gradually, the image of that simple man became a symbol of something much greater. A reminder, a warning, an anchor. In a world where haste devours relationships and ego dictates the rules, Samuel emerged as an antidote, like a page from an old book that someone finally decided to read. And what they found was more than a biography. It was a lesson in humanity. One of those stories that don't fade with time, because they're made of what time can't erode: character, legacy, and truth. And perhaps the most beautiful part of it all is remembering that Samuel didn't plan anything. He just showed up, just wanted to play, just wanted to feel one more time the wind on his face and the peace of being in a place he once called home. But in doing so, he triggered something even the best event planners couldn't design: a moment of pure transformation. Because in the end, it's these silent, unexpected, soulful stories that have the power to change everything. In that club, where age had once been mocked and simplicity mistaken for weakness, a new culture was born. A culture where the past has a voice, where wrinkles tell stories, where respect isn't bought, it's earned. And it all began with a curious look at an old golf club. Because sometimes to recognize a legend, you just need to stop looking at the shine and start seeing the essence. The video went viral like lightning under a clear sky. In less than 24 hours, it appeared on international sports pages, celebrity profiles, and even in motivational and leadership groups. The most repeated headline was simple but powerful. Never underestimate a heart that has carried the world on its back. Because that was the essence of Samuel. It wasn't about golf. It was about what one carries in the eyes, on the shoulders, in the soul. It was one of those stories that cross generations because they don't rely on words. They rely on presence. Samuel, unknowingly, became a symbol of something the world had forgotten. Respect. Not for skill, not for achievement, but for the dignity with which he faced mockery. While everyone pointed, he breathed. While they laughed, he aligned his stance. And in the silence of his swing, he taught more than many instructors with microphones. That's why the image of his shot became a mural in clubs, posters in schools, and wallpaper on young learners' phones. Because some stories don't just move, they redirect paths. A few days later, a news network tried to interview him live. Samuel declined. He said it wasn't a time for vanity, but for reflection. He suggested they bring underprivileged children to visit the course, the same one where he had been mocked. He wanted them to see that they belonged there just as much as anyone else. And that marked the beginning of a new chapter in this story, the Golf for All project, envisioned by him and embraced by those who had once scoffed at his presence. The club, pressured by public attention, offered the space once a week for free lessons. At first, it was merely to ease social pressure, but gradually even the staff began to change. The security guard who once avoided eye contact now helped set up the kids' clubs. The groundskeeper offered fruit from the trees after lessons, and the instructors, once cold, began listening to the children's stories, as if hearing life lessons. Samuel didn't just open the door, he taught them how to enter with empathy. Brian, the young man who had led the laughter that day, reappeared weeks later, this time with his head down. He apologized publicly, not out of obligation but because he understood the damage careless words can cause. And in that moment, in front of everyone, he handed over his own state trophy to Samuel, saying, "You won something far greater than a championship. You conquered my prejudice." The scene was captured by one of the students, and once again, it went around the world. Some stories are so powerful, they write themselves. The emotion spread far beyond the club. A renowned university created an elective course called Conduct and Humanity in Sports, using Samuel as a case study. Companies included the video in their empathy-based leadership training, and in public schools, teachers asked students to write essays on the theme, "Who is the real champion?" In every one, Samuel's name appeared, not as a sports legend, but as a master of integrity, because stories like his teach more than any textbook. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his simple routine. He rode the bus to the club, brought fruit and water for the kids, and used the same old golf club. He declined sponsorships, brand deals, and paid speaking gigs. He said he didn't want to turn his story into a product. He wanted to turn it into a bridge. And each child learning to swing with calm and respect was a brick in that bridge, one he built with his own hands. The community began to mobilize. They organized a fundraiser to create an inclusive sports center in his name. Architects, teachers, and even former athletes from other disciplines joined forces. They wanted that story to have an address, a structure, and continuity. And when they presented the project to Samuel, he cried, not out of gratitude, but because he realized that what once caused him pain had now become his direction. And to him, that was the greatest trophy he could receive. Then something unexpected happened. An old rival from his professional tournament days showed up. His name was Jerome, known for being competitive, proud, and stern. After seeing the video, he booked a flight and went to the club. Upon arrival, he asked to speak to Samuel in front of everyone. He admitted that years ago he too had looked down on him, that he never understood Samuel's calmness, his faith, his dedication. And now, seeing the impact of his actions, he realized he had missed the chance to learn from the best. The two embraced in silence. Once again, a story of pride became a lesson in humility. As months passed, gatherings at the club grew. Students came from other cities. Entire families showed up to watch. Some said it was more therapeutic than any coaching session. It was different. No loud music, no promises, just a well-trimmed lawn, a 78-year-old man with shining eyes, and a line of children believing they could be great, not by winning, but by respecting. And there, more than golf, they learned about character. Because stories that teach us to love others are always the most necessary, until the day came when Samuel could no longer attend. His health was beginning to demand his time, but he left everything in place: a pedagogical plan, videos with detailed explanations, and letters for each child he had guided from the beginning. In one of them he wrote, "If at any point you are doubted, take a breath, align yourself, and aim calmly." Sometimes life's greatest success comes right after someone else's biggest mistake. Simple words that became the mantra of an entire generation. Brian took over the lessons. With a different posture, a more attentive ear, and eyes trained to see the invisible, he expanded the project to other regions, and he always made a point of saying, "This class only exists because someone you never met believed you were worth it." Because some stories don't need a physical presence to keep existing. They just need well-planted seeds. Today, the club is a national reference in sports inclusion. There's a memorial with Samuel's name at the entrance reading, "Sport reveals talent, but character reveals a champion." The phrase was chosen by one of the students, who said she learned more in one Saturday with Samuel than in an entire year of school. And that is the true power of stories, turning the simple into something sacred, making the ordinary a path to greatness. The impact was so strong it went beyond the club's walls, entering the boardrooms and unsettling the comfortable silences that had upheld that elitist structure. For the first time in decades, Samuel's name, once never even mentioned, now echoed through the luxurious hallways. Not as a joke, not as an urban legend, but as a symbol that exposed how much that institution had ignored, dismissed, and erased valuable stories, simply because they didn't fit the standard mold. The president, a man used to scripted speeches and cold protocols, came under pressure. Society was reacting, the videos were circulating, and the comments piled up with criticism and indignation. But beyond public image, something inside him was also touched. Maybe it was Samuel's unwavering gaze, or perhaps the silent tears of a young man moved by his story. Either way, he made a decision. He personally sought out the man who had once been invisible and invited him to be honored at the next National Veterans Tournament, broadcast live with press coverage and the presence of dignitaries. At first glance, the gesture seemed noble, but Samuel, with his 78 years of lucid humanity, knew how to read between the lines. He knew not every tribute stems from admiration. Sometimes it comes from fear of facing one's own reflection. So he hesitated. He wasn't comfortable with the sudden spotlight from people who had ignored him for so long. He didn't want to be remembered just because he became a headline. His stories weren't written for the stage. They were written to open minds. And he only accepted the invitation on one condition. He wanted to bring a group of youth from underprivileged communities to learn real golf, with ethics, discipline, and respect. But it wasn't just about learning how to play. It was about rewriting the narrative of what is possible for those who had always been taught to give up. Samuel didn't want to create elite athletes. He wanted to shape conscious citizens. His proposal was bold: to transform a sport long seen as exclusive into a tool for inclusion, to plant new stories in the very soil where so many had been uprooted, and to do it inside the very club that had once looked down on him. The board was stunned. They expected passive acceptance, maybe even emotional gratitude. What they received was a yes filled with purpose, a yes that required real action, not just ceremony. And so the planned tribute became something greater, a historic agreement. Samuel would have the freedom to select the youth, create a training plan, and use the club's facilities on weekends. For the first time, the gate once closed to those who didn't belong would be open to those who truly needed opportunity. The first sessions were quiet. Many of the youth arrived wary, eyes carrying the usual traumas: rejection, invisibility, early weariness. But one class with Samuel was enough to change something. He didn't talk about swings or technique right away. He spoke of dignity. He told stories, of resilience, of silence, of resistance. He explained that each stroke could be a statement, that the golf course was just a metaphor for life, and they understood. Some parents came to the club for the first time just to see if it was real. They stood at the gate, moved, watching their children being treated with respect by men in suits. It seemed like a dream, and in a way it was, but a dream born from discomfort, injustice, and the courage of a man who refused to be a background character in his own stories. Over time, what began as a project became a movement. The youth started to stand out not only for their performance but for their presence. They began receiving invitations to events, interviews, roundtable talks, and Samuel always made it clear, "We're not here to impress. We're here to transform." He wasn't chasing trophies. He was chasing echoes. And every young person who crossed the club's greens was an echo of his own journey. Now, with a new destination, the press returned, but this time, not to exploit a scandal or write sensational headlines. They came to document an everyday miracle. The club, once a symbol of segregation, was becoming a beacon of inclusion. And all thanks to a simple man with a soft voice and steady gaze who decided his stories wouldn't end with empty applause, but with open doors. The president, once vain and distant, was transformed alongside the club. He began attending classes, talking with the youth, truly listening. One day in public he declared, "Samuel didn't just change our image, he changed our soul." And on that day, it wasn't the journalists who applauded. It was the staff, the former players, the parents, and even the old members, who now saw the club with new eyes. And Samuel, he remained the same. No vanity, no rush, no need for validation. Because those with a true story to tell don't need to prove anything to anyone. They just keep writing. And that's how he inspired other clubs, other institutions, and other people to do the same. Because when one story touches another, it doesn't stop. It multiplies, it expands, it transforms. Years later, one of the young men who started with Samuel became a teacher. Another became a sports therapist. A girl from the first group won a regional tournament and donated all her prize money to open a golf school in her community. And they all said the same thing. "It was Samuel who taught me to see beyond the fence." Not the fence of the golf course, but the symbolic fence that prejudice builds between worlds. The tournament tribute, of course, happened, but it wasn't what people expected. There were no long speeches or exaggerated pomp. Samuel asked for just one thing, that every young person from the underprivileged neighborhoods present should come on stage with him, because they represent the future I always dreamed of. And it was there, on that shared stage, that the stories took on a new meaning. They were no longer about one man. They were about everyone who dared to believe. Brian could no longer hold on to his air of superiority. The video, the comments, the reactions, everything portrayed him as the villain of a story he didn't even realize he was writing. From rising athlete to cautionary tale, his fall from grace was fast, harsh, and public. But the most painful part wasn't the criticism. It was the respect he began to feel for Samuel. For the first time in a long time, Brian felt ashamed, not for what was done to him, but for what he had done to someone else. And that realization hits with the weight of 1,000 bricks. Then, in a rare act of true humility, Brian did what many avoid out of pride. He apologized in public. It wasn't automatic, cold, or rehearsed. It was sincere, heavy with meaning, pain, and learning. In front of teammates, coaches, curious onlookers, and even cameras that happened to be there, he bowed to Samuel and asked for forgiveness. He said he had judged without knowing, mocked without listening, and acted as if the world revolved around his own golf club. And these stories of redemption, though rare, are always the hardest to build, and for that reason, the most powerful. But he went further. He took his own state trophy off the shelf and handed it to Samuel as a symbol of admiration. He said that in that one swing, he learned more than in all his years of training, that while everyone else sought power, he saw in Samuel the beauty of grace, that he would never again treat an opponent with disdain. The gesture moved everyone. There stood a young champion, giving up his symbol of victory to acknowledge that greatness doesn't always fit inside a trophy. Samuel, with tearful eyes, accepted, not the trophy, but the commitment being born in that moment. Stories that unite generations always carry the power to heal, to reconcile the past with the future. And Brian made a promise. He wanted to train with Samuel. He wanted to learn the technique, yes, but above all the posture, the patience, the humility. He wanted to understand how someone could win without shouting, teach without humiliating, and exist without needing to prove anything. Samuel, who never turned away anyone with an open heart, welcomed him in, not just to teach how to strike the ball, but how to listen, to the wind, the silence, and to others. Because a golf course, when used right, is more than a sport. It's a school. A school where time isn't measured in holes played, but in perspectives transformed. And so began a learning journey that would become something even greater. Because some stories don't settle for being just stories. They want to become legacy. And that's exactly what happened. Brian and Samuel began training together every week. At first, curiosity brought them together. Then came respect. In no time, a friendship was born. An unlikely friendship, built between pauses, glances and silences that spoke louder than words. Samuel told old tales, stories of hard-learned lessons from mentors, and the mistakes he himself had made. Brian listened like a student before an oracle. But the most beautiful part was that Brian didn't just listen, he practiced. He began to change his behavior in tournaments, at home, on social media. He used his visibility not to show off, but to highlight the values he was learning. He made videos talking about respect, about listening, about how the greatest athletes are those who grow even in defeat. And he always mentioned Samuel, not as a footnote, but as his source of inspiration. And these stories, once they find a voice, begin to plant seeds. Soon other young people drew near. They wanted to know what was going on. Why was that once arrogant boy now calling a simply dressed old man his greatest mentor? And Brian told them. No embellishment, no excuses. He told them about the shame he felt, the invisible slap he received, and the transformation that began right there. And every time he told it, someone saw themselves in the narrative. Because everyone has judged someone by what they wear, how they look, or what they carry in their hands. These stories remind us that prejudice is easy. The hard part is unlearning it. Then came the idea, why not create a program to unite young athletes with unknown masters? A project where the resume doesn't matter, only the heart does. Samuel agreed immediately. He said it was time to give back to the world a bit of what he had received. And Brian pledged to fund the initial structure. That's how Between Holes and Bridges was born, a program of sports and emotional mentorship, where golf was just the excuse. The real content was listening, coexistence, and humility. The project grew. Schools began requesting lectures. NGOs volunteered to host the gatherings. And suddenly, that shameful episode became the spark of a silent revolution. Samuel, once invisible, was now called the Professor of Respect. Brian, once the face of arrogance, became a symbol of change. Together they showed that the most inspiring stories are the ones where mistakes aren't the ending, they're the turning point. The golf course became a stage for emotional encounters. Parents brought their children to see the duo. Kids were enchanted by Samuel's calm presence. Teens admired Brian's courage to admit his mistakes. Companies began to support the program, and universities proposed adding it to their curricula. Because everyone realized that this story, so simple at first glance, held deep layers of humanity, redemption, and togetherness. And Samuel, he remained the same. Simple, smiling, generous. He said he didn't want fame. He just wanted the next generation not to go through what he went through. He said he would trade all the trophies in the world for a world where no one is judged by age or clothing. His words became tattoos on the souls of those who heard them, and every encounter became a new lesson. Not in golf, but in life. Because some stories teach more than any book ever could. Today, years later, the Between Holes and Bridges project has expanded to other states. It's been translated into multiple languages, turned into a documentary, and featured at international conferences. But the most moving part isn't its reach, it's its essence. The essence of two lives that collided by chance, transformed by choice, and united by purpose. Brian and Samuel didn't just create a program, they built a bridge made of owned mistakes, sincere forgiveness, and shared wisdom. And maybe, deep down, that's exactly what the world needs. Fewer judgments and more bridges. Fewer trophies and more exchanges. Less appearance and more presence. Because when the right stories meet, even silence has the power to heal. And when a young champion gives his trophy to an old master, it's not just a gesture, it's a message. A message that there is still hope. For sports, for youth, for society. And sometimes all we need is to listen, humbly, to those who've walked a little farther than us. What began as an apology turned into something no one expected. A sports inclusion project founded by Samuel and Brian. Two different worlds, two generations that once clashed, now walking side by side with the same purpose. Together, they started visiting public schools, community centers, and nonprofits. bringing not just clubs and balls, but hope. Because the best stories are born when ego gives way to mission. The project spread like wildfire. Children who had never stepped onto a grass field were now learning to align their bodies, breathe deeply, and aim calmly. More than just golf, they were learning discipline, focus, and respect. 3 virtues capable of changing any reality. Brian, now humble and dedicated, taught with passion. Samuel, with the patience of a master, shared his stories to inspire. Every class was a chance for rebuilding. The duo became a symbol of transformation, from prejudice to partnership, from arrogance to attentive listening. In every city, more youth were being impacted, more clubs were opening their doors, and more people were understanding that sports can indeed be a powerful bridge. And gradually, what started as a simple project became a movement with a name, a purpose, and a soul. But the most beautiful part was yet to come. Everything changed when a teenage girl named Julia appeared at one of the workshops. She used crutches. Shy, frail, she avoided eye contact. But Samuel approached her with the same respect he used when speaking to directors of elite clubs. He asked if she wanted to try a swing. Julia gave a timid, uncertain smile and said she could try. And she did, and missed, and tried again, until she hit it, and cried. And in that tear, the entire project reached a new level. Julia's story went viral, not because she was an example of overcoming challenges, but because she made everyone look in the mirror. The image of a young girl with motor difficulties playing golf with fierce determination moved the nation. TV stations contacted the organizers. Companies wanted to sponsor. But Samuel held on to the essence. No empty marketing. What mattered was real impact. And Brian remained by his side as both apprentice and mentor. Golf courses, once silent and elitist, began to echo with laughter, diverse accents, and joy. Children from favelas, indigenous youth, wheelchair users, immigrants, all sharing the same space with the same respect. The stories that emerged there were more than touching. They were necessary because they gave voice to the unheard, visibility to the invisible, dignity to those who had only known exclusion. It wasn't long before universities, institutions, and even public agencies started inviting Samuel to share his journey. He didn't use slides or rehearsed phrases. He brought his cane, his worn-out club, and a wisdom you can't find in books. He spoke about how he had once been invisible, how people had wronged him, how he learned not to wrong others in return, and how he chose to turn contempt into service. That's what golf taught me best. How to wait, how to listen, how to begin again. These words became mantras in classrooms, companies, and even rehabilitation centers. Brian, once impatient and arrogant, became a role model for the youth, not because he was a former champion, but because he had the courage to say sorry, to humble himself in order to grow, and to use his influence to open doors. New generations saw in him a possible example, a man who had failed, fallen, and chosen to rise, alongside the one he once humiliated. As the years passed, the project gained its own headquarters. An old country house was renovated through anonymous donations and named Field of Stories. Each room was named after a student who had overcome a barrier. Julia, of course, was the first. Next to the front door, a phrase painted in large letters moved every visitor. Here, no one asks where you came from, only where you want to go. The movement grew. Events were held. Inclusive tournaments created, and clubs joined the cause. Some still resisted, preferring to keep golf as a sport for the few, but they were soon left behind. Because where there is truth, there is no room for walls. And the stories told there were spreading with power. Schools in other states began replicating the idea. Athletes from other sports asked for help setting up similar projects. And suddenly what was born out of humiliation became public policy. Yes, the local government approved an official program to promote inclusive sports based on Samuel and Brian's model. It was the first time golf was introduced into public schools in the country, and not as a mandatory subject, but as an invitation to reconnect with one's self-esteem. Because more than teaching how to play, those classes taught how to exist, to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. Then came international recognition. A documentary about the project was nominated for awards and screened at renowned universities. It wasn't a high-budget production. It was simple, like Samuel's Club, but it was truthful, impactful. The interviews with the students, the mothers' testimonies, the smiles of those who never imagined holding a golf club. It all showed that yes, there's still space for good stories. There is still a thirst for humanity. At the end of each episode, Samuel would appear seated, gazing at the field, silent, sometimes with teary eyes, not from sadness but gratitude, because he knew he wouldn't live forever, but his mission would, because the stories we plant with dignity continue to blossom long after we're gone. Brian knew this too. That's why he began training a new generation of mentors, ensuring the cycle would never be broken. Today, the field of stories is not just a place, it's an idea, a way of living, a philosophy that challenges norms, provokes institutions, and welcomes the unseen. And it all began with an old man dismissed because of his appearance, and a young man who almost missed the chance to learn from him. But he didn't. He learned. And with him, the world did too. Years later, the impact of that day at the club still echoed like a persistent whisper through once silent hallways. Samuel's presence, though physically absent, could still be felt between the course's holes, in the conversations among the youth, and even in the respectful silences of those who once laughed at him. His story didn't end there. On the contrary, it gained momentum, became a symbol, and crossed the club's boundaries to become a reference in places where golf wasn't even part of the conversation, like classrooms, international conferences, and corporate leadership programs. The image of the frail elderly man lifting his old golf club and silencing the club's elite became a case study taught by educators who focused not only on technique, but also on empathy, listening, and humility. Because in truth, the lesson left behind wasn't about sport, it was about soul, about seeing the human being beyond what the eyes suggest, and that, as simple as it may seem, is still revolutionary in many places. That's why when people speak of Samuel, they speak of a turning point. One of those stories that mark the before and after of a culture. Back at the club where it all began, the changes were deep, starting with the main entrance. Where once only the names of the founders were engraved, a new plaque appeared. Simple, but impactful. On it, the phrase Samuel spoke at the peak of his humiliation. Age wrinkles the body, but prejudice wrinkles the soul. That sentence became a symbol. It was photographed, shared on social media, and adopted as a motto at events. No visitor passed by without stopping, reading, and reflecting. Because some phrases aren't just spoken, they're felt. Young people who once weren't even allowed on the course now had a place and a voice. On Saturdays, the field was opened for sports clinics. Children from poor neighborhoods, elderly folks forgotten by their families, people with disabilities, they all became part of a club that once seemed made only for the few and flawless. A true cultural transformation began there, subtle, yet firm, and it was born from a story of contempt that turned into redemption. And what about Brian? The young man who once embodied arrogant youth now became the primary ambassador of Samuel's teachings. Not out of obligation, but by choice. He understood that humility isn't learned from books, but through encounters, and his with Samuel was the greatest of his life. That's why it wasn't rare to see him quoting the master in lectures, clinics, or videos. He became known as the master's student, and he lived up to the title through action. He founded an institute, Samuel's Legacy. Focused on promoting inclusion in sports, the project brought golf to communities where there were once only deflated soccer balls and makeshift wooden clubs. But more than teaching how to sink a shot, Brian taught people how to see each other, how to respect, to listen, and to recognize when a silent person is saying a lot. Because stories, like Samuel's, teach even through silence. The institute gained support from companies, NGOs, and even the government. It became a movement inspiring young people to see sports as a bridge, not a wall. In Brian's words, Samuel didn't just teach me how to play, he taught me how to live with dignity. That phrase, spoken with tearful eyes in an interview, swept across the country and made many want to know who the old man was that changed a young man's trajectory. They discovered a story worth telling in every school. Samuel's health weakened over the years, but his clarity remained sharp. In one of his final public appearances, he was invited to open the International Congress on Sports Ethics in Lisbon. In a wheelchair, he spoke for only a few minutes, but they were enough to move the audience to tears. He said, "What brought me here wasn't the club, it was the perspective I carried. And what will take you forward is the perspective you choose to have." He received a standing ovation. That statement also became a mural in several universities. In one of them, an auditorium was renamed, Samuel Andrade Auditorium. In the entrance hall, a permanent exhibit featured photos from that day at the club, testimonies from people transformed by his story, and a video narrated by Brian recounting all they had lived. It was impossible to watch without getting emotional, because stories like this aren't just good, they're necessary, but something even deeper remained. Samuel, even from behind the scenes, cared deeply about the future of the next generation. He knew his path was an exception, and that many clubs out there still shut their doors to anyone who doesn't fit the mold. That's why he quietly created an anonymous educational fund to finance scholarships for underprivileged youth to practice so-called elitist sports. His only condition? No publicity. He wanted the story to speak for itself, and it did. One of those scholarships supported a girl named Julia, who would later become a national golf champion. When receiving her award, she said, "I'm only here because a man I never met believed in me." The auditorium fell silent, then erupted in applause. Another seed planted by Samuel, another story that blossomed from the invisible. What's most beautiful is realizing that it all started with a simple act. An old man entering a place where he wasn't welcome, and staying, remaining, resisting. Because sometimes, resistance is the loudest cry. And that afternoon, without raising his voice, Samuel cried out for everyone who's ever been ignored for their age, their appearance, or their origin, and he was heard. These stories, of those who stayed when everyone wished they'd leave, of those who taught without seeking applause, of those who turned rejection into purpose, remind us that there's still hope for this world. Not because there'll always be a Samuel, but because maybe you are next. Yes, you, the one reading this now. Maybe you've been ignored, or worse, maybe you've ignored someone. This isn't an accusation, it's an invitation, a call to look more closely, to listen beyond the noise, to let the right stories pass through you before discarding them because of the cover. How many stories like Samuel's have you ignored just because the packaging looked too simple? An old man wearing no-name clothes, walking slowly, holding a worn-out golf club. Nothing about him stood out in a club where appearances mattered more than character. Yet he walked with dignity, silent, but whole. In a place where status screamed, he was met with whispers, sneers, and polite disdain. Not because he did anything wrong, but simply because he didn't seem to belong. It's strange how we've learned to measure a person's value by such shallow things. A shirt, a haircut, a slower gait. And without realizing, we stack up judgments like we're experts in labeling. But life has a ruthless way of flipping the script, and that's exactly what happened at that club. It only took a few minutes, one perfect swing, and a chilling silence fell over the field. The laughter stopped, eyes turned, and truth began to speak. Samuel wasn't there by accident. He was a former champion, a living legend who had stepped away from the spotlight by choice. He had chosen peace over prestige. But talent, that never left him. And when he decided to show it, he didn't need a single word. The sound of the ball cutting through the wind spoke for him. The applause came, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because in that instant, everyone understood what they had lost by judging too soon. One of the most human and harsh stories unfolded before them, the kind that exposes prejudice and elevates humility. How many times have you tuned out an older person thinking their time had passed, that they were outdated, too slow for today's fast-paced world? Maybe their time is just beginning again, because experience doesn't retire, it renews itself. And people like Samuel don't live in the past. They exist to remind us of the present we ignore, of the stories we miss, because we're too distracted by the superficial. Samuel could have left after the first humiliation. He could have said, "This isn't for me," but he stayed, because he knew that sometimes you have to let time speak. And time did, through his action, his skill, his posture. Those who mocked, learned. Those who underestimated, shrank. Those who ignored, finally listened. Because when truth shows up, it doesn't ask permission. It simply takes the place it always deserved. And what about us? How many stories have we dismissed because of haste, prejudice, or inattention? Maybe we crossed paths with a Samuel in a grocery line, on a park bench, in a waiting room, and didn't notice. Maybe they even tried to start a conversation, offer advice, share a memory, and we looked at our phone, pretended not to hear, assumed it was just another old person talking. But it wasn't. It was a whole life, distilled in a phrase that might have changed ours, but we didn't listen. The truth is, we're forgetting how to listen, and worse, we're forgetting how to respect. Respect has become rare currency. We only give it to those with fame, followers, or fancy clothes. And that says more about us than it does about them. Because those who only respect outward shine will never see the ones who shine from within. That's why stories like Samuel's are essential. They act as mirrors, sometimes smudged, sometimes painful, but always revealing. What would you do if there were a Samuel in your life? Would you listen? Learn from him? Or walk past him like so many did at that club? Would you be one of the first to laugh? Or one of the last to clap? Ashamed? The choice seems simple, but it speaks volumes. Because those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat the same mistakes, without the wisdom to fix them. Drop a comment. What's the biggest lesson this story gave you? What snap judgment have you made before? What prejudice have you carried and are ready to let go of today? Your answer may seem small, but it might inspire someone else. Sometimes, a sincere confession is the spark that begins a transformation. Sometimes, admitting we were wrong is the greatest sign of growth, and maybe that's where your new story begins. Here, every video isn't made to distract, it's made to awaken. If you've read this far, it's not by accident. Maybe something in you is also craving less noise and more truth, less posing, more purpose, less judgment, more listening. Because we don't need more filters, we need more attentive eyes, more open ears, more soul in every encounter. If you want to keep diving into real stories that transform, challenge, and teach, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Each video is an invitation, not to believe what we say, but to feel what we live. Because truth isn't imposed. It's felt, it's shared, and when it's strong enough, it becomes a movement. And one last thing, when you meet a Samuel in your life, don't judge the cover. Ask, listen, observe, because inside every seemingly ordinary person might live one of the most extraordinary stories you've ever known.